Good evening. I'm Karen Hansen, Executive Vice President and Provost of the University of Minnesota. I am delighted to welcome you to this celebration of the 50-year partnership between the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and the University of Minnesota's Department of Economics. We have the distinct honor and privilege of being joined this evening by the four horsemen of Minnesota economics: Professors Edward C. Prescott, Thomas J. Sargent, Christopher A. Sims, and Neil Wallace. They'll share their perspectives on Minnesota's global influence on economic research and policymaking over the past 5 decades, and share their thoughts on some of today's most challenging economic issues. Our speakers are outstanding representations of a long tradition of excellence in the University of Minnesota's Department of Economics. Indeed, 9 of the university's 22 Nobel laureates are associated with the Department of Economics, and several more are here with us this evening. So first, I'd like to thank the Heller-Hurwitz Institute and its board members for assembling and hosting this important event with generous support from the Bruce and Bonnie Paulson Endowed Lectureship. The Heller-Hurwitz Economics Institute was founded in 2010. In collaboration with the Department of Economics, the Institute provides and communicates economic research that informs and influences public discourse and public policy, as well as the Academy. The mission of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis is to serve the public by fostering a growing economy and a stable financial system that works for all of us. The Federal Reserve Bank's core values of service, integrity, inclusion, initiative, accountability, and objectivity are also core values of the University of Minnesota. So we believe we are ideal partners. To provide a bit more information about the history of the 50-year partnership and to introduce the four horsemen, I want to introduce Dr. Art Rolnick, Senior Fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Rolnick previously served at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis as a Senior Vice President and Director of Research and as an Associate Economist with the Federal Open Market Committee, the monetary policy banking body for the Federal Reserve System. As many of you in the audience probably know, he has worked tirelessly to advance multidisciplinary research on child development and social policy in order to make the world a better place for all children. And we are honored to call him an alumnus of our esteemed economics department. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Art Rolnick.
Thank you, Provost Hansen. You've been a great supporter of this partnership and a leader at the university, and we are honored to have you here tonight. When we first started planning this event, and they told me they were going to have it at this hall, I was worried. I thought, we're lucky, generally we're lucky to get 100, 125 people, so I said, it's going to be empty. I am thrilled that you're all here to celebrate our 50th anniversary. As Provost Hansen said, we are here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of a very unique and fruitful partnership between the University of Minnesota and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. It is so fitting that this event is being hosted, and housed by the Heller-Hurwitz Institute. For the seeds of this partnership were planted well over 50 years ago by who else? Walter Heller. And in many ways, the four horsemen, Neil Wallace, Tom Sargent, Chris Sims, Ed Prescott, who built on the work of Leo Hurwitz and others in the department, became the foundation of this partnership. So by way of introducing the four horsemen and the theme of this panel, I thought I would give a very brief history of how this unique partnership grew into one of the most renowned economic environments in our profession. But first, Ellen McGrattan told me, we better make sure people know who the four horsemen are. And indeed, and how did they get coined, the four horsemen? So this is Jim Simler. He was the chair of the department back in the 80s, and he kind of had in mind when he coined this term, the four horsemen of Notre-Dame, comprised of American football players at the University of Notre Dame under coach Knute Rockne. They were the backfield of Notre Dame's 1922 football team. In 3 years, they lost only 2 games. So I'm sure Jim had in mind in 1983 that he was managing a department that contained 4 scholars who were driving macroeconomic research and econometrics to exciting new heights. And so, with Notre-Dame, 1922 in mind, he anoints Wallace, Sargent, Sims, and Prescott as the 4 horsemen of the Minnesota Department of Economics. And the local press, quoting Jim Simler, makes it official. Dave Hage at Star Tribune, Linda McDonald at the Pioneer Press, names you may know. So that was in 1983. Now, on to this new, unique partnership between the U and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So as I said, the seeds were planted by Walter Heller, and he was having a variety of discussions with the president of the bank in the mid-60s by the name of Hugh Galusha. And Hugh Galusha, at that time, was looking for an economic advisor. Heller recommends Professor John Kerrigan. John Kerrigan embodied the idea that research should influence policy. But he also encouraged the idea that policy, Fed policy in particular, can and should influence research. This is the theme, if you will, of this panel. Kerrigan then recruited Neil Wallace in 1969 to work on some very special projects, and the partnership was born. That's why 69, 50 years. Several years later, Kerrigan and Wallace demonstrated just how policy and research interacted in a very theoretical paper that anticipated the S&L crisis of the 80s, and indeed, I would argue, anticipated the financial crisis of 2008. Wallace was to go on to challenge the conventional theories of money, raising fundamental questions about why unbacked paper money would have any value. This research continues to influence scholars and policy today. Shortly after Kerrigan recruits Wallace, Wallace recruits Tom Sargent, an amazing coup. And Wallace and Sargent, heavily influenced by papers by Robert Lucas at the University of Chicago, would go on to challenge the very basic foundations of macroeconomics, Federal Reserve policy, and even the ability of the government to manage the business cycle, laying the building blocks for the school of thought known as rational expectations. Chris Sims arrives a few years later and introduces a revolutionary and more effective way of forecasting the economy, models which have become standard tools for both econometricians and policymakers. Ed Prescott then comes to Minnesota in the early 80s, and the rest is history. In 2004, Ed Prescott receives the Nobel Prize, which he shares with Finn Kidlin, one of our many distinguished visiting scholars here in Minnesota. And they received the Nobel Prize for their contributions to dynamic macroeconomics, time consistency of economic policy, and the driving forces behind the business cycle. 2011, Tom Sargent, Chris Sims share the Nobel Prize for the empirical research on causes and effects in the macroeconomy. And here in Minnesota, we're anxiously awaiting the Nobel Prize for Neil Wallace. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the 4 horsemen. And as I said, the theme of this panel is how policy affects research and how research affects policy, the interaction that many of us have lived with here in Minnesota and thrived with it. The format's going to go something like this. We're going to give each horseman 10 minutes to give opening remarks. And then I have a number of questions that I've been saving up for years to ask the individual ones. So, Neil, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Art. Some of Art's dates are not quite right, but they're approximately okay. I came to the University of Minnesota as an instructor in the fall of 1963, and then defended my PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago 1 year later. And I was very young, and I also was quite unproductive for a few years. And starting in 1969, John Kerrigan, who really, I think, deserves all the credit for initiating what became this hugely productive connection between the Department of Economics and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis Research Department. Kerrigan was a good friend of mine and a valued colleague, and I don't think whatever success I've had in the profession, I don't think I would have had it but for his action. So I remember him with great fondness and admiration. But sometime around 1969, Kerrigan had been, as Art described, economic advisor to the president of the Minneapolis Fed at that time. A little bit strange, it took a special dispensation from the Board of Regents to allow him to essentially hold 2 full-time jobs, which he did. But anyway, that happened. And our first research project, Kerrigan had the idea that we should try to clarify what Federal Reserve open market policy was about, and in particular, its use of things like the quantity of money, which at that point had then been called an intermediate target variable. So he enlisted me and a colleague, Tom Munch, to work on this with him and another economist at the Fed, Thomas Supel, as I recall. And we wrote a little paper which got published, which sort of clarified this notion. One thing that I remember from those early days, I put on a tie today, and I don't wear a tie usually. I had almost forgotten how to tie one. But anyway, I've never been a very snappy dresser, but I was not a rival in that dimension to Tom Munch. But anyway, I remember it was kind of summer, and Tom and I were visiting the bank, and we would have lunch with Kerrigan and, talk about a variety of things. And for a while there, we were having lunch in what was then something called the officers' dining room at the bank. And you got to picture Tom Munch and I in shorts and sandals and some kind of shirt. And after a few of these lunches, there came to be a rule at the bank called the Munch-Wallace rule, which was a dress code for the officers' dining room. So we never showed up there again because it was easier not to have lunch there than to meet this dress code. Kerrigan and I went on to to work on a number of topics together. I was sort of making the transition to actually learning a little economics at the time. And I learned it by writing papers. And it's not what we recommend students do, but so be it. And some of what we worked on, I think, might come up in later discussion. Art mentioned we did a little work on deposit insurance and the moral hazard that it gave rise to. That was a topic that arose really directly from policy interests of the research department at the Fed. We worked on some papers a paper on international currency substitution, and that might come up in a bit of the later discussion. But this connection between the department and the Federal Reserve Research Department was something that was sort of a huge boost to both places. The connection made appointments in the Department of Economics much more attractive to potential faculty than would have otherwise been the case. And the connection was copied in part by many banks at the regional feds within the Federal Reserve System. At the time, Minnesota was way out in front in doing that. Research departments have for many years been judged by a group at the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System. And there came a time, partly because of, I think, what was going on in the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, that publications in academic journals became part of the rating system of research departments. And Minnesota, with a very small research department, ranked very well. So this kind of connection has been a great influence, to my knowledge, within the Federal Reserve, and has been partly emulated by other banks, but it was first done here. So I think there'll be other remarks later on. I hope you find this evening enlightening. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
I may have had some dates wrong, but it wasn't a little contribution.
Well, let me start by saying, repeating what people have been saying, which is Minnesota, at the time when the four of us were there, was just an amazing place. I learned new stuff every day by talking to my colleagues, and my career would not have been what it has been if it weren't for the interactions we had in those days. I've always been uncomfortable with Simler's marketing of us as the Four Horsemen. For one thing, I'm sure that what came to Jim's mind first when you said the Four Horsemen was the backfield of the Notre-Dame team, but what first came to my mind was the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So I really don't like that very well. My wife, just a little while ago, texted me to tell me that she wasn't going to be able to make it to the panel discussion. She said she's going to miss the Four Pointy People panel. And I thought that was actually much less pretentious way to describe us. So I want to talk a little substance about an area of my research that I was specifically not awarded the Nobel Prize for. If you look at the citations for the Nobel Prize that Tom and I won, Tom's section discusses his contributions to the theory of fiscal policy and monetary fiscal interactions. My section has a footnote that says Sims has also worked on monetary and fiscal policy. But his views are controversial. So let me try to describe my views. I'm talking about some ideas that in the economics literature have generally been put forward in papers with complete dynamic general equilibrium models that involve transversality conditions and Euler equations. And for a general audience like this, that's not the way to describe them. So I'm going to try to describe the ideas without writing down any equations. The economists in the audience may find this frustrating, but there are papers underneath this. And in fact, there's a book by John Cochran, which is maybe 2/3 done, which is freely available on the internet. So if you really want to pursue this, you can look at that. And also, Mike Woodford, at the beginning of his career, wrote a couple of very complete and very careful papers on these ideas. This is the idea. The ideas are labeled by economists the fiscal theory of the price level, but in some sense, they're just accounting relationships. So the title is low inflation, low interest rates, low unemployment, big deficits, ? Explanation point. The idea is, I think we don't really have any consensus theory that can pull these facts together. If you had told most economists 30 or 40 years ago that we're going to have decades of interest rates under 2% or even negative, going with rapid expansion of the public debt, very low inflation, and low unemployment, most of them would have found no way to imagine how that could have happened. And I think we really still don't have a very clear understanding, partly because I think there's really more than one possible explanation. But I think we ought to be talking about it more than we do. If you look at what's being done in macroeconomic research now, not much of it is focused on this issue, but it's the great puzzle, and it's very important to policy. If you look at the political dialogue these days about debt and deficits, you see, going back to the early Bush administration, Vice President Cheney was quoted as saying, "Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter." That's the right-wing deficits don't matter heresy. But recently, the left wing has realized that they shouldn't leave this political opportunity alone, and we have what's called modern monetary theory, which doesn't quite deny that there's any problem with deficits. The best people in this who are putting these ideas forward put in at the end of their discussion that, of course, running deficits eventually could cause inflation, but we know how to take care of that with taxes. And what's left out of that theory is that the amount of taxing we're going to have to do is connected to the amount of deficits we run in advance. Anyway, there's a kind of vacuum that professional economists are that are allowing to develop in the political discussion, and we need to talk about it more. So let me give you one simple explanation of why we're getting these rapid expansions of debt. It doesn't explain why the interest rate is staying so low. It's the possibility that we oversold central bank independence. Volcker ended the inflation of the 70s by showing that he was ready to push interest rates as high as necessary and creating a big contraction. That convinced people that the central bank knows how to control inflation. and that it was important to have central bank independence so this central bank that knew how to control inflation could do its job without political interference. So the idea of central bank independence is there's a clean separation between fiscal and monetary policy. Monetary policy is controlling the inflation rate, and it doesn't tax or spend, meaning it uses open market operations. It buys and sells government debt. Fiscal policy is the one that decides what taxes and spending are, and they are to pay no attention to the objectives or tools of the central bank. They're to leave the central bank alone. But then exactly why is it that fiscal policymakers should worry about deficits? If we really believe the central bank can always control the price level, the path of prices and the inflation level, no matter what the fiscal authority does, then why should the fiscal authority or the legislature ever worry about debt finance? The debt in most advanced countries, certainly in the U.S., is mainly nominal. It promises payment of paper that the government can print. So the chance that the government defaults in the sense that it can't produce what it promised to produce is very small. So there's really no danger of an outright default on government debt. And if an ordinary individual tries to roll over debt indefinitely and let the debt grow and grow, he'll eventually find that nobody will lend him any money because people will be afraid he can't pay them back. But if the government rolls over debt forever, and the central bank can guarantee that the price level remains stable no matter what, why does the government have to worry? Why does any buyer of government debt have to worry? It's guaranteed that the paper the government promises when the debt is matured will have a rate of exchange with real goods that's pinned down by this all-powerful central bank. Now, of course, in principle, the return on this nominal government debt can dwindle because of inflation. But if you accept the premise that the central bank is in charge of inflation and is fully able to control it without reference to what the fiscal authorities do, you get the conclusion that the inflation risk is just not there. So how do we think about what does determine inflation? We have to bring in fiscal policy somehow. And the simplest way to think about it, that certainly people in financial markets understand easily, and many lay people I find understand easily. Well-trained macroeconomists often find it harder to understand, is the idea that the price level is the rate at which all kinds of government nominal liabilities trade for goods. It's money, it's mature 30-year bonds, it's mature 10-year bonds, mature 90-day bills. They all trade for goods at the price level. Most of the government liabilities are not currency. They are interest-bearing securities or interest-bearing deposits at the Fed. So when you think about it that way, it becomes natural to think, well, if the government issues a lot of this nominal paper and people don't really have a good reason to hold it, they're going to try to spend it on real goods, and it's going to make inflation increase. That's an old idea in monetarist models where interest-bearing debt is kind of abstracted from or regarded as always implicitly backed by taxation. It becomes, when we start putting together currency which has transactions value and government debt, which may have some transactions value but does pay interest, then we have to recognize that the reasons people are willing to hold the government liabilities aren't just transactions value, they also include the promised return from taxation. And so a government deficit, a rapid expansion in debt, may or may not produce inflation. What that depends on is whether, when people are taking in payment for government purchases, government liabilities, bonds or currency, whether as they do that, they regard the deficit that's pushing out this additional nominal debt as changing their beliefs about the future taxation that backs the debt and how their beliefs are changing. You might think the naive, obvious thing to do is to suppose that when the government runs a big deficit, that should make you think, well, they're going to run even bigger deficits or more deficits in the future. But standard economic models used in macros say the exact opposite, that every time government issues debt, it makes people's beliefs about future deficits go down, not up. But everything depends on exactly how the issue of current debt is connected to people's beliefs about future deficits and surpluses. So I think I'll stop there. That's laid out the basic ideas. I think, let's see if I got the next plot here. This is something to think about until we come back to these subjects again. This is the time series plot of U.S. primary surpluses. That is, one way to think about it is it's the amount of expansion of the nominal debt. It's also government expenditures other than interest payments, or is government revenues minus government expenditures other than interest expenses. And you'll see that, and this is a ratio to the total amount of government debt outstanding, the market value. In 1975, under President Ford, there was a huge primary deficit, bigger than anything that had been seen relative to total debt since the 50s. Then there was, after that, there was a period in which deficits were more common than surpluses, and debt rose rapidly. That was the early Reagan administration. And then we had this big positive peak. Exactly why is not clear, but it did this peak, which comes from a long sequence of large primary surpluses. So you're going to get that. You can hardly see it. This peak. This is the Clinton administration, Bush administration. So that buyers of government debt could look at that history and see, well, we did have a huge primary deficit, bigger than anybody had ever seen in 1975. But a couple of decades later, we had huge primary surpluses that completely offset it. Overlaying all of this is a pattern where these negative dips are in recessions, and then you get a sharp V and a recovery to positive primary surpluses as we come out of recessions. But at the very end here, the big drop, and we started to have the expansionary rise, and we've now flattened out. And we don't seem to be continuing the V-shaped peaks and troughs. So we'll talk about this more later, and I'll stop there.
Thomas?
I'm just going to follow up on what Art and Chris said. So I'll remind you where the four horsemen came about. First, it came from Christianity in Revelations. I reread that last night, and and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It looked to me like someone was on drugs. Okay, and I don't think Simler had read it either. I don't think he knew about it. Okay, but he knew football. He really liked football. So did Kerrigan. Okay, so here's my slides. Oh, by the way, great economist here, Tim Kehoe. Thank God for Minnesota economics. He says that all the time. Okay, so there's Jim Simler, a wonderful man. He was a manager, a great manager, because the people in the economics department in Minnesota in the 70s and 80s. Let's say everyone had a personality. Jim had been a naval officer, managing soldiers and shooting at Japanese during the war, so it was no problem for him. So he always had the right thing to say to everybody. So various people would come in, and they didn't know anything about football, but they knew a lot about opera, and he would compare them to Caruso. So there's Albrecht Dürer's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. It's pretty scary. Okay, so here's this. Here's where Simler got this. Grantland Rice. And there's very little poetry in economics, but there is poetry in sports writing. And Rolnick got the date wrong. It's 1924. And here's what Grantland Rice said. Economists don't write like this. Even Sims and Wallace. Okay, so outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the Four Horsemen rode again. In dramatic lore, they are known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Stooldryer, Miller, Crowley, and Layden, the four backs. They formed the crest of the South Bend Cyclone, before which another fighting Army football team, was swept over the precipice at the Polo Grounds. What I hope to learn at this event, finally, is which one of these guys is famine, pestilence, construction, destruction, and death. And I'm just going to stop here.
All yours, Ed.
There's been a revolution in economics, in aggregate economics. The place that had the greatest influence in this revolution is Minnesota, and as I will be explaining subsequently. I was trained in the 60s, and we used to use things called ISLM and supply and demand, but for aggregate analysis, I don't let my students use the word supply and demand. If they're doing a microanalysis, which is occasionally the case, that's the language that you use. That it is 50 years is appropriate. The key turning point, I think, was in 1969. The year Investment Under Uncertainty was written. Lucas started out trying to come up with a better equation for the macroeconometric models of the 60s, the Hicksian. Ended up that doing industry equilibrium, you couldn't. Had to do a general equilibrium. So, of course, he saw, I got brought into it because I knew recursive methods, which had to be extended to deal with competitive equilibrium models and dynamic economic analysis. I want to emphasize this is general equilibrium. Any transaction, there's somebody on both sides. And I guess Art again got me interested in the development issues and gave a talk to the board and asked questions. Gary Stern was very supportive in this period. He had listened to us. He was interested in what we were doing. There was enthusiasm. He he had a lot of healthy skepticism, which is good. I'm a skeptic. Then there's this sort of movement in asset values. We see lots of movements in asset values. There's so many questions we want to do. We want to say, what are alternative monetary and fiscal systems? There's so many good research problems. How can we set up a system that would help Brazil or Mexico get rid of some of the corruption? Or, for one thing, we do not yet have the answer. We will.
So, Chris, I'd like to start out with a question for you related to Olivier Blanchard in his January 2019, January 4th presidential address, American Economic Association presidential address, tries to make the case that large expansion of our federal deficit is not as problematic as many think. I have a hunch you don't agree. But you want to comment on that view?
Yes. It's not that I don't agree, it's that I'm not as sure about it as he is. He works in a framework where he's working out the consequences of the low interest rate on government debt. Interest rate historically on government debt in the U.S. has been low enough that if the government just rolled over the debt and let it grow at the interest rate, it would
No, it's the interest rate relative to the growth in the economy.
Right. So the economy would grow faster, so that debt would not grow relative to the tax base. And he works out numerical exercises looking at the historical fluctuations in the rate of return on government debt and asks, under what conditions might we actually get into an explosive path for government debt, and argues that based on history, it's not very likely, and that suggests that debt finance is not very dangerous and that the level of debt we have now is not very dangerous. I have a recent paper where I took a quite different modeling perspective. Instead, his perspective was he didn't look at distorting taxes at all. He was thinking and he looked at intergenerational effects primarily at intergenerational effects of various time paths for the government debt. The idea that if we don't tax now, our descendants later will have to pay for it. I worked in a framework with a single representative agent and asked, why is the government debt paying a lower rate of return? And I set up a simple model where it pays a lower rate of return because it has a transactions value. This is as the interest rates on currency, deposits at the Fed, and Treasury bills seem to be coming together into a very narrow range between 0 and 2%, or minus 0.75 and 2%. The distinctions between currency and other kinds of government liabilities begins to seem a little bit artificial. If you group them all together, you can argue that all kinds of government debt are valuable to people because of their liquidity. You can always sell government debt quickly. If you're trying to sell it, the purchaser doesn't have to ask you to wait while he looks up which kind of government debt this is or who issued it. It's a very uniform, information-free asset. And so it's valuable for that reason, and people are willing to buy government debt at lower interest rates than they'll buy other kinds of assets. But the same is true of money, of currency in a model where there's no interest paid on money. Blanchard coins this idea of this phrase, what does he call it? Zero fiscal cost debt. And that he applies that phrase to the situation where you can issue debt and never have to tax to back it up because the interest rate is below the growth rate. But once you start thinking about it in a model like the one I'm working with where there's a representative agent, so there's no intergenerational transfer involved, but there are distorting taxes. So if you have to tax a lot, it's very costly. Then you realize that there is really a cost, even in this zero fiscal cost situation. Actually, money always is zero fiscal cost government debt. You issue money you issue currency that's not interest bearing. You never have to tax to back it up. But we don't recommend that. We finance all our purchases, government purchases, by money issue, because it's well accepted that if we did that steadily, consistently, it would cause inflation. Well, the same insights apply to interest-bearing debt that has an interest rate lower than the real rate of return on other assets. If you try to steadily finance expenditures by issuing government debt, even if the interest rate is below the growth rate of the economy, you will get inflationary pressure, and there's nothing that the Fed can do about it. That's the insight that comes from the fiscal theory way of looking at it. That money is that interest-bearing debt is in the long run just as capable of producing an inflation as issue of currency or non-interest-bearing government liabilities. Now, exactly how long it takes for inflationary pressures to arise is a hard question. If you look at the recent U.S. history, actually history of Japan, you look at the debt going up steadily, interest rates staying at zero steadily. You have to ask, what's going on? Is this debt becoming more and more valuable for liquidity purposes? That has some plausibility. We had the crisis of 2009. Japan had a big crisis earlier in which firms and individuals learned that liquidity could really be valuable when the financial system falls apart. But I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that all of the rise in government debt can be explained as increased demand for liquidity. And so it leaves a little bit of a mystery. Another possibility is that people really are convinced that when the deficit occurs, that it will be financed by future taxes. And this is the argument that Finn Kindlon made yesterday in the panel, that therefore, as the deficits increase, people become more and more pessimistic about how much taxation is going to occur in the future, how much their Social Security and Medicare is going to be cut. So deficits become contractionary rather than expansionary. That's another possibility. A third possibility, which I think is a realistic possibility and very worrisome, is that with years or decades in Japan of experience that the inflation rate always stays at about zero, or between 0 and 2%, so nobody pays any attention to it, that inflationary expectations are stuck at zero. And people don't look forward and say, well, these big deficits, eventually they're going to have to cause inflation. People just look at history and says inflation never happens no matter what the government policy of the day seems to be. If that's true, we could go for a long time expanding the debt to GDP ratio and only at some distant date finally reach the reckoning where people no longer are willing to hold this stuff, in which case, at that point, it would be a very unpleasant resolution.
So you use the term unpleasant. That's a nice transition. One of the most cited papers of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis is Unpleasant Monetary Arithmetic by Tom and Neil. But Tom, you want to jump in on this one?
Well, I wanted to ask Chris if he knows anybody from Argentina. But anyway, I won't.
Expand on that.
No, so Neil and I wrote a paper called Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic, and so I have to tell you, this is one of a string of papers that I wrote with Neil, and every single paper, Neil told me, take my name off. If it is, I don't want my name on it. And then somehow, anyway. So that's kind of unpleasant. So, but it actually says something about Neil. Neil had. So I regard myself as extremely lucky because I came here and I was completely lucky to get a job here. Chris got me a job here, and he doesn't even remember it. He saved my life because I was asked to leave Penn within a year of when I went there, and that shook me up. I didn't even tell my wife because I was so manly, and I started looking for a job, and I heard, "We'll call you, don't call us," over and over again, and it felt pretty bad. Somehow somebody must have called Chris and told him that there was this guy looking for a job, and Chris got me a job here, and then my life changed because Neil was here, and then Chris was here, and they basically told me I didn't know anything all the time, and I'd gone to Harvard, and they beat that out of me, which was really good, and I've thanked both of you before, but so this is a wonderful place to. And actually, this was a place where if you publish one paper in every 2 years in those days, you were regarded as a high publishing person. Tom Munch got tenure without publishing any papers, and that was viewed as that kind of a normal thing. And what I did is I got here and I was a total fraud, because I didn't know any math. I'd never had a proper calculus class, and I faked it. I got through Harvard fine, but I came here and I'm teaching first year macro, PhD macro, and the students are all taking they're taking a real analysis class, either at the undergraduate, and I'd never had that. So I'm teaching them, and various students would come up to me, and they were very nice, but they said, "Why are you teaching us?" And I was 7 or 28 years old, and I said, "I can't learn." This went on for about 3 years. Kim Border, who I remember, he came up to me one day and he said, "You're just the opposite of Rudin," and he said, I said, "Oh, what?" He says, "He makes very complicated things simple." and I said, "Thank you." and it took me 2 days to figure out that I shouldn't have said thank you. But anyway, so when I was 30, and I was trying to read papers by Chris, faking it, I snuck into the remedial math class. And there was one graduate student in that class, and he said, "What are you doing in here?" And I said, I'll kill you if you tell the other students that I'm here." So I did there, and then every year, and it was fine with Hurwitz and Heller, that I spent all afternoons. I spent most of my days studying math and trying to catch up. Anyway, and you could do that in Minnesota. And I was even regarded as a high publisher, but it was a wonderful place. And just for young guys, you didn't have to. People were really encouraging, mostly, and I don't know. It was a fantastic. The students we had, which we should mention, Rao Ayagari, Bruce Smith, some who aren't with us, and Life's Not Fair, Scott Freeman, Rao Ayagari, Randy Wright. In some ways, I don't think he's here. Marty Eichenbaum, Larry Cristiano, just name after name, Albert Marcet. I'm leaving a hope. George Tauken in the econometrics class. I audited his class, and I audited Neil's class a whole bunch of times. And it was fine. But the people who were near, there were students like George Tauken would suggest theorems. It was marvelous to watch Chris prove a theorem. One day, somebody found his notes They were written on a coffee cup. And the note said, "Prove central limit theorem." And anyway, so that's what it was like.
I thought I asked a question about Argentina.
Sorry.
Let me make a minor correction. First of all, this legend about the coffee cup has grown and grown. The central limit theorem part about it, I never heard before. Also, the way I remember it, you and I had a phone conversation in which I realized you had independently invented Granger-Simms causality and had a paper on it that you never did more with. And I thought that meant you were really smart, and that's why I told Kerrigan and Wallace they should hire you.
Okay, so this is okay. There's some truth in that, but not much. It's like a tweet from various people. Okay. So here's the truth in that. I was in way over my head, and I was trying to learn something called distributed lags in those days. And I was trying to learn something called spectral analysis. And I was reading books I wasn't entitled to. But I had a computer program, so I took spectral analysis, and I estimated distributed lags in the frequency domain. I wanted to regress yt on xt minus 1, xt minus 2. You do spectral analysis, and you get yt on xt minus 1, xt plus 1, xt plus 2. I didn't want those in there. So they're in there, and I say, how in the hell are those future values coming in? And I scratch my head, and I start reading everything I get my hands on. And I find a paper by Aki. And Aki has it's obscure paper. He says, if you find future values, it's an indication of reverse causality. I have no idea what he's talking about. I call Chris up at that point and say, Chris, I'm estimating, I completely fake it. I'm estimating two-sided distributed lags I'm estimating distributed lags within the frequency domain. They're turning out to be two-sided. I can't figure out what it is. I think it might be causality, reverse causality. And he says, oh, I have a paper on this. And he sends it to me. It's money, income, and causality, which I get that paper. I couldn't understand that paper for 5 years. So he thought I was, he said he thought I was smart. And I kind of was, but there is a God.
And let's try to get back to some of the questions I was working on.
Oh, could I have one more thing to say?
Argentina?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Rational expectations, what does that mean? Because we all use it. All four of us use it. And it's used widely in the economics profession. It's an incredible assumption. So I'll tell you what it means. We build models of dynamics, and that is things are random and they move over time. That means they're sequences. It's not just today, it's tomorrow and tomorrow, ever-ending future, ever-ending past. Okay, fine. In a world like that, people care about the future. They care about the past because they influence it, but they care about the future. They want to know what policies are going to be in the future. So they have to form beliefs about the future. How do they do that? They have a theory about the future. And how many people are on Earth? I don't know, 8 billion? All 8 billion people in our models have to have a theory about the future. So now think about the number of parameters. You have to have a theory about all the beliefs of 8 billion people. So how do you do it? What rational expectations assumes is communism. And what I mean by that, there's one model. It's shared by every single person in the model. It's shared by the model builder, and it's shared by God. And when you do Lars Hansen-style GMM, or maximum likelihood estimation, like he does, you use that ruthlessly. But what it does is it makes all sorts of things disappear. It eliminates free parameters, simplifies the model. So there's not heterogeneous beliefs due to different models. You might have different information. So that's turned out to be a very powerful thing, which has been, it's used without question now. Some people are starting to challenge it. But rational expectations, it doesn't have anything to do with thinking people are smart. It's a confession that we're dumb and we can't handle lots of parameters. Anyway, That's all I have to say.
That's all. Neil, one of the big changes that's happening in money is this cryptocurrency. I'm having a hard time with it because I was taught that unbacked fiat money could only be issued by government. A private person would have a hard time issuing fiat money if they didn't back it with something. I'm a little confused about the cryptocurrency, whether it's backed or not. It seems to be filling some gaps out there. Your views on it, and should the Federal Reserve be worried about cryptocurrency taking over the medium of exchange?
So, cryptocurrencies are, they've been of great interest. I remember going to some conference and I get in share a taxi with some woman who's going to the same area in Madison, Wisconsin as I am. And we start chatting. She asked me why I'm there. I'm at some conference and what kind of economics do I do. And right away this topic of cryptocurrencies come up. So there are different kinds of cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is unbacked, the kind of thing that is now being talked about by Facebook and so on. It claims it's going to be backed. So those things are very different. Let's talk about unbacked.
Let's do it.
If you come along and you say, hey, here's a bunch of blue pieces of paper. Why don't you give me a haircut? I'll give you some of my blue pieces of paper. The person giving you the haircut is going to worry about two things. At least two things. One thing they're going to worry about is, could someone else effectively counterfeit these blue pieces of paper and therefore, issue unlimited amounts of it, which is going to push their value down? That's one thing they're going to worry about. Another thing they're going to worry about is what you're going to do in the future with your printing press that can turn out blue pieces of paper. Are you going to issue a bunch in the future? So one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is it seemed to take care of these two issues.
And how is that?
Well, I'm not in computer science, but it sounds like there's an effective upper bound on the amount. And it sounds like it's sort of hard to break in and just create additional amounts of it. Now, so suppose they've solved those two problems. So I've been working for, certainly the past 25 years or more, and it's been a challenge throughout the economics profession is, how do we get models in which stuff like this, these pieces of paper in limited quantities that can't be counterfeited. There are sort of two questions. I mean, there was one question about why does the stuff ever have value?
Right.
And then there's a question about, does it perform a social role? Is it beneficial? But it's kind of interesting. Every time we asked those questions, we made exactly these two same assumptions that Bitcoin seemed to solve, namely fixed supply, pretty much, and not easily counterfeited, or not counterfeited at all. So you could say whatever theory we had about government fiat currency, you just carry it over and you get Bitcoin. Now, one of the things that John Kerrigan and I did, and I think I mentioned this earlier, we wrote a paper about currency substitution. And we wrote a paper that said international exchange rates, nominal exchange rates, were indeterminate because of potential currency substitutions. Now, people noticed that paper a bit and said, well, do those assumptions really work for government currency? But that might be somewhat debatable. I'm told by economists in Canada that I know that not so long ago, Canada passed a law that said that holders of Canadian currency were going to be residual claimants on the assets of the government. That sounds a little weird. What does that mean? But anyway, I mean, that was an attempt to get away from the pure fiat aspects of currency. But anyway, so people could debate whether the assumptions that Kerrigan and I made about international currencies and currency substitution, really apply to government currencies because of various rules that might be in effect for government money. But whatever we said certainly applies to multiple cryptocurrencies. Warren Weber, in a discussion this afternoon, said that there are 2,000 cryptocurrencies. And here we're talking about the unbacked nature. And anytime an economist, I think, looks at this situation, they think that there are multiple equilibria, that the future value of Bitcoin could be zero, could certainly be zero. We could wake up tomorrow and everyone would say, well, I'm not interested in accepting this stuff. And if people had that belief, that would be it. And the set of multiple equilibria for stuff like this, when there are multiple objects like this, are huge. And so that's where we are.
Very good. I think we're out of time. I want to thank the four horsemen. I want to thank Heller Hurwitz Institute. I want to thank the University of Minnesota for this opportunity, and thank you for being here. Dean, I think you're on. Dean Coleman, College of Liberal Arts. And he's here.
Thank you very much with the talk of the apocalypse. I feel a little like the Grim Reaper coming in to end the festivities, but I want to thank all of you for being here. I am John Coleman. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. This has been an important evening and part of an important sequence of events, some of the panels that were mentioned earlier in the academic conference that is going on. And tonight and these days have been about celebrating and highlighting this partnership, this strong partnership between the Department of Economics and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. This partnership has stood the test of time, and it has, as was noted earlier, been emulated by many other institutions around the country, but this is the original and the real deal. This is a partnership that will continue to shape and influence public policy for the next 50 years. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for making this such a memorable event, Professor Ed Prescott, Tom Sargent, Chris Sims, and Neil Wallace. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Art Rolnick for his terrific job in organizing this event and really being the inspiration behind much of what has happened here over the past few days. And also thank our generous sponsors who've made this event possible, the Heller Hurwitz Economics Institute and the Bruce and Bonnie Paulson Endowed Lecture. So as a liberal arts college at a land-grant research institution, we in CLA have as our mission to spark dialogue and debate and to help inform public policy and practice. And tonight's event has been a perfect embodiment of that ideal, and I very much appreciate your attendance and your interest. I hope that you will join us in the future for other Heller-Hurwicz or economics department's events. There are many over the course of the year, or indeed hundreds of events that are held across the college and the campus throughout the year. Very much welcome you here to the University of Minnesota. I invite you now to stay a bit longer and join us for refreshments, which will be out in the lobby. Again, thank you all for being with us, and good night.